What I learned today is that thoughts are individual, but emotions are universal. And I think that's why a lot of people argue on the base of emotion. And a word that I hear so much right now is triggered. And I think it's people are colloquially thinking that it means, triggered like a gun, set off, angry. Well, that might be a way of thinking about it, but it's not the actual meaning for triggered. I mean, before the SJWs got a hold of it and shit all over it, it used to actually talk about a psychological aspect of reliving a past trauma. Now, you might think, oh, well, when I say triggered, I mean that. Do you? Do you really mean that? What trauma did you go through that when you hear someone say, "Good morning, beautiful," you fall apart? Because I don't think you really understand what being triggered is. Let Moggy explain it to you. Being triggered has a lot to do with things that you've endured in your past, and it's not always just a one-off thing. It's typically a long-standing, repeated and sustained mental or emotional abuse or torture. Not so much, one time this thing happened. Another way you can tell whether or not you're being triggered or being more SJW triggered is think of what the core emotion is. All right, there's only probably about 5 different core emotions for every human being on this planet. So try and think of what the core emotions are. I mean, even Lantern Corps shows different colors for rage and fear. And that's the thing. A lot of people are talking about triggered like, that triggered me. I'm so triggered. And they mean angry. They mean pissed off. When you're talking about triggered, psychologically speaking, you're talking about fear, panic, unreasonable desire to flee, an overwhelming sense of dread. I want to give you an example. I have been diagnosed with PTSD. I've gone through some things in my past that maybe one day I'll get into, but suffice it to say, I sometimes would hear, for example, I lived in the basement and I would hear the person coming after me, walking across the floor overhead. They were military, so you could always tell from the particular gait and cadence of their steps kind of what their intention was and where they were headed. Needless to say, now I don't live in places that have an upstairs, or at least not one that you can hear in the downstairs, and, particularly echoey floors or hallways. If it's that specific thing, it's not something I can listen for. I can't sit there and consciously be aware of it happening necessarily. I'm not aware until after it's happened, until the panic starts. Now here's where it gets a little serious. When people talk about being triggered because they're angry, I understand that you mean well, and you're using the word that everybody else uses. But I want you to consider what I'm about to say. When I hear someone walking in that specific way, my heart drops through my body. My chest aches as my heart actually speeds up. My hands and my feet sweat and are freezing cold. All the blood's leaving my extremities. My jaw aches and I get a headache because of the tension that I'm not even aware I'm exerting on my jaw. My back feels like someone has taken a bucket of cold ice water and thrown it at me, and yet I feel like I'm on fire on the inside. When it's over, I feel like I've run a marathon. Like every muscle in my body aches because I was tense all over. I feel nauseous. My mouth is so dry I can barely breathe. That's what being triggered feels like for someone with PTSD and the true meaning of triggered in psychology. That kind of fear is not something that comes up in conversation. It is something that is so ingrained, so insidious and subtle that it just sneaks up on you and you don't know it's happened until it's past. So I caution you, when you're going to sit there and express that you are triggered because of someone's joke offending you or because the political sphere didn't follow your desires, consider the fact that there are people out there who are genuinely triggered by things that they cannot control. And stop confusing your outrage with their primal fear. If you think you're being triggered, ask yourself, what emotion am I feeling? Because if it's anything other than heart-stopping fear, you're not being triggered. You're just angry. It's a sick, sad world. I'm Moggy. Cheers.